Join me tonight on YouTube at 7 p.m. Eastern, where we will live stream the NFL schedule being released. Live reactions and all coming your way here on Jaguar Gator 9. And now, on with our feature presentation. Well, today's the big day. If you're watching this video on the day that it drops, then you know that tonight is the night that the NFL schedule gets released. We're going to know all 272 games, when they're played, what network has the rights to what game, and what games are being shown in prime time. Even if we know beforehand exactly what teams are playing each other, this is still an exciting event that signals the start of a brand new season. It's a time for fans to have hope, officially buy their tickets and plan their weekends for the final few months of the year, and plan trips to cities to watch their favorite team play. Tonight, we get the finalized version of the NFL schedule, and it's going to feel oh so good, because it truly means that we are one step closer to a brand new season. But now, I want you to imagine that after tonight, the NFL takes another one of its 10,000 looks at the schedule and says, wait a second, time out. Something doesn't look right. This team got absolutely screwed over with their matchups. For one reason or another, something about the schedule when it came to one of the teams and the location of their games was wildly unfair and didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense when you break it down. And the NFL decided, after the opponents were announced, to say, change of plans. We're redoing that part of the schedule. We're putting out a clarification that something went awry. Something like that seems ridiculous, right? You had the opponents and whatnot right in front of you for years in advance, and only now are you changing the schedule because you realize something was wrong? Well, entering the 1989 season, as crazy as this hypothetical scenario might sound, that's what happened to the Green Bay Packers, when the NFL decided, after announcing their opponents and who they'd be playing and where the games would be, to switch it up and give them a completely different schedule than what was originally announced. And this is the story behind one of the strangest schedule releases in NFL history. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and what the game plan got changed to, we need some context to understand how the Packers did in 1988 to get the schedule that they were given, and what the original game plan was. I know this video is talking about the 1989 season and the schedule release, but how the Packers did in 1988 is relevant due to the incredibly complex nature of how the schedule worked back then. Long story short, as you can tell from all these lowlights, in 1988, the Packers were bad. Like, really bad. As in, with the exception of the Dallas Cowboys, they were the worst team in all of football. They ended the season with a 4-12 record, which was tied for their worst record in 30 years. And thanks to an abysmal offense that finished third worst in the league in points scored by averaging just 15 points per game, the Packers ended the season as the worst team in the NFC Central. Yes, the Detroit Lions were also 4-12, but based on how the tiebreakers worked, Detroit finished ahead of Green Bay in the standings, meaning that in the 5-team NFC Central, the Packers were 5th. And that was massive when it came to scheduling implications, because the schedule back then was extremely complicated, and was a complex formula that required quite a few degrees to understand how it worked. Today, the 17-game schedule formula is pretty easy. You play 6 games in your division. You play 4 games against another division in the conference. You play 4 games against another division in another conference. You play the other 2 teams in your conference that had the same standing in their division as you did. And for the final, special 17th game, whatever division you played 2 years ago, you play the team in that division that has the same standing as you. Everyone plays by the same set of rules. And it's a pretty simple, easy to understand formula, where you know the moment the season ends, what your schedule is going to be for the following season. In 1989, not so much. When you've got 28 teams broken up into 2 conferences of 14 teams, and 3 divisions of anywhere from 4 to 5 teams, coming up with a schedule can be pretty tough. It's not a well-balanced number like 32. Each team played a schedule that fit one of 3 different criteria, depending on where you finished and what division you played in. If you were in a 5-team division and didn't come in last place, you played an 8-4-4 schedule with 8 division games, 4 games against teams in your conference, and 4 games against teams in the opposing conference. If you were in a 4-team division, so the AFC Central or the NFC West, you played a 6-6-4 schedule with 6 division games, 6 games against teams in your conference, and 4 games against teams in the opposing conference. And if you were a last-place team in a 5-team division, like the Packers were in 1988 in the NFC Central, you played an 8-6-2 schedule with 8 divisional games, 6 conference games, and 2 games against the opposing conference. That in itself is already strange, especially since this schedule meant that the Packers would have a home-and-home series against the Dallas Cowboys, a team not in the NFC Central. However, the important thing is that by virtue of coming last in the NFC Central, the Packers played the first-place team in the NFC West, as well as the 4th-place team in the NFC West. This meant that in 1989, the Packers would have a home game against the San Francisco 49ers and a road game against the Atlanta Falcons. This was set in stone, and just to prove that point even further, the Atlanta Constitution wrote that the Packers and Falcons would play each other in Atlanta during the 1989 season. And to emphasize this even further, the Green Bay Press-Gazette also flat out said that Green Bay's schedule of non-divisional opponents was a home game against the 49ers and a road game against the Falcons. That was going to be Green Bay's schedule in 1989. However, when the NFL looked at the schedule after announcing the opponents and the location of the games, the league said that something didn't feel quite right, and something felt unfair. Let's look at Green Bay's prior history against San Francisco. The last time the Packers and 49ers played each other was on December 6, 1987. In that game, the Packers lost 23-12, thanks to 2 touchdown passes by Joe Montana. And when you look at where that game took place, that one took place in Wisconsin, taking place at Lambeau Field. Prior to that, the last meeting between the Packers and 49ers was won by the 49ers on October 26, 1986, as in a game at Milwaukee County Stadium, the 49ers won 31-17, thanks to 2 pick-sixes in the 4th quarter, as despite only having 18 minutes of possession, they made up for it by making Randy Wright's stay under center a living nightmare. That one took place in Wisconsin. Prior to that, the last meeting between the teams was on October 18, 1981, when the 49ers, in a low-scoring and windy affair, won 13-3, with the lone touchdown coming in the 3rd quarter from 1 yard out by Johnny Davis. That game took place at Milwaukee County Stadium, marking the 3rd straight meeting between the teams in Wisconsin. Prior to that, the last meeting between the teams was on November 9, 1980, when the Packers won by a final score of 23-16, as with the game tied at 13 apiece heading into the 4th quarter, rookie fullback Jerry Ellis, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, scored the deciding touchdown from 8 yards out. That game also took place in Wisconsin, with this one being held at Milwaukee County Stadium. But we're not done yet, because prior to that, the last meeting between the teams was the final day of the regular season in 1977, when on December 18th, in a meaningless game between 2 teams below 500 and out of the playoff picture, the Packers won 16-14, leading the contest wire to wire while forcing 3 turnovers. That game, once again, took place in Wisconsin, being played at Milwaukee County Stadium. And prior to that, the last meeting between the teams was on opening day of the 1976 season, when on September 12th, the 49ers won 26-14, winning thanks to a 2-touchdown performance by running back Delvin Williams, which would be a sign of things to come for him as he made the Pro Bowl later that season. That game, you guessed it, took place in Wisconsin, taking place at Lambeau Field. That was 6 straight games between the Packers and 49ers to take place in Wisconsin, whether it was in Green Bay or Milwaukee. To find the last game between the Packers and 49ers that was actually held in San Francisco, you had to go back to December 8th, 1974, when the 49ers won 7-6. It had been nearly a decade and a half since the Packers played in San Francisco, and yet in that same time stretch, the 49ers played in Wisconsin 6 times. And on the flip side, looking at Green Bay's prior history against Atlanta, while it wasn't quite as bad, it was still off-putting to say the least. The Packers and Falcons literally played each other in 1988, in a game that was won handily by the Falcons by a final score of 20-0, as the Falcons forced 7 turnovers, including 4 interceptions on the combination under center of Don Majkowski and Randy Wright. That game took place at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, home of the Falcons. Prior to that, the last time the Falcons and Packers played was a way more notable game, and one of the greatest regular season games in NFL history that still lives on more than 40 years later, as on November 27, 1983, the Falcons won 47-41 over the Packers in a thrilling overtime affair. That overtime victory by the Falcons took place at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium in front of their home crowd. And prior to that, the last time the Falcons and Packers played was on December 26, 1982, during the strike-shortened season, as the Packers clinched the playoff spot with a 38-7 drubbing over the Falcons, thanks to 2 touchdown runs by Eddie Lee Ivory and 2 touchdown catches by Hall of Famer James Lofton, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. That game took place in Atlanta at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. So you had to go all the way back to 1981 at the start of the decade to find the last time that the Packers and Falcons played each other in Wisconsin, even though since that meeting, they had played 3 times, and all 3 times, the game took place in Atlanta. And the NFL looked at this and said, wait a second, that's not fair at all. It's not fair to local fans who have to see the same matchups over and over without any variety. And it's not fair to fans of those respective teams that are living out a market that never get to see their team play live and in person, even though they're in the same conference. If you were a 49ers fan living in Green Bay, and you were 4 years old the last time you saw your team play in 1974, so you weren't even in kindergarten, by this point in 1989, you were in college. It was that long of a wait. And when the NFL saw that the 49ers and Packers, based on the scheduling formula and the way this complex system worked, were going to play each other for the 7th straight time in Green Bay, and saw that the Packers and Falcons were going to play each other not just for the 4th straight time in Atlanta, but for the 2nd time in back-to-back years, the NFL stepped in and said, yeah, we messed up, guys. We're changing the schedule. Green Bay, you're now playing San Francisco on the road, and you're playing Atlanta at home. Now, as absurd as this might seem that the league could just change the schedule after announcing where the games would be played and whatnot, they had the power to do that. It hadn't been enacted before, but in 1987, the NFL passed a bylaw that said that for games within the conference, the commissioner had the power to change the location of the game for fairness reasons, mainly to ensure that no team played back-to-back seasons at home against the same opponent, which allowed fans to watch their team play out of market and allowed for new matchups to try and sell tickets. However, this ruling by Commissioner Pete Rozelle, even if it was in the best interests of Green Bay from a fairness perspective, kind of screwed over Green Bay, seeing as not only was their 1989 home schedule significantly less attractive now that the defending champion 49ers weren't coming into town, and not only did the Packers now have to travel for their toughest game of the season simply because the commissioner felt like it, but they now had to travel to the West Coast twice and make 2 of those long trips, as they already had a scheduled road game against the Los Angeles Rams. So this ruling was kind of a double-edged sword. Yeah, it allowed for fairer matchups from a historical standpoint, in the sense of not playing at the same site over and over again, but it really screwed the Packers over on paper for 1989. It's tough to imagine something like this happening today. Could you imagine if Roger Goodell, after announcing the Jaguars' schedule and their home game against the Cincinnati Bengals, decided to just flip the site to Cincinnati because he wanted to, or the Eagles' game against the New England Patriots was now in Philadelphia instead of Foxborough? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1989 in this absolutely bizarre controversy that was a pure circumstance of the nature of trying to devise a fair schedule on a year-to-year basis in an unbalanced league with 28 teams. You can't make everyone happy. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.